Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to everyone who's here and all of those who are joining us online. My name is Sunila, Kale, and I'm a professor in the Jackson School of International Studies, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here for such a wonderful occasion. We are here to celebrate the recent publication of James Lin's book. Let me read his bio. James Lin is a historian of Taiwan and its interactions with the world in the 20th century. His book, In the Global Vanguard, Agrarian Development and the Making of Modern Taiwan, was published open access by University of California Press in 2025. James received his BA and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and MA from Columbia University. At the University of Washington, he teaches courses on the modern history of Taiwan, US-China-Taiwan relations, and thematic courses on development, capitalism, science, technology, and the environment. He currently serves as Associate Chair of the Taiwan Studies Program and will serve as Chair of the program starting in the fall. So the way this will work is that James will give us a presentation about his book for about 40 minutes. I'll take moderator's privilege to ask him a couple of questions for another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor to questions both from those who are gathered here and those online. And if you're joining us online, please feel free to type your questions in the comment section. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'm going to turn things over to James. Thank you so much, and please joining me in welcoming James.
Thank you, Sunila. First, I'd really like to thank our just fantastic staff. So thanks to Ellen, to Nevi, and Senna. They've been working so hard, like day and night, for all the events that we're putting together for the Taiwan Studies program. So thank you all for all the work that you're doing. For this talk and the other talks, I'd also like to thank my colleague, Professor Sunila Kale, for agreeing to moderate, and also for reading the book so carefully. So I look forward to our discussion. My presentation today, as Professor Kale has introduced, is based on my newly published book, In the Global Vanguard, Agrarian Development and the Making of Modern Taiwan. So published open access. You can read it for free without resorting to LibGen or other databases of questionable legality. The book is a history of agrarian development, beginning in the Republican era in China, and then to Taiwan starting in 1945, and ending in all corners of the Global South during the Cold War period. The first chapter begins with Republican era China, where I examined the early roots of developmentalist approaches to famine relief efforts of missionaries and rural intellectuals. After that, I shift to Taiwan. Chapter 2 critically re-examines land reform in Taiwan as a state capitalist project, reshaping the landscape of Taiwan into what I call a capitalscape. Chapter 3 explores agricultural science and farmers associations in Taiwan, which form the backbone of what I term the Taiwan model of agrarian development. Chapters 4 and 5 focus on how Taiwanese agricultural scientists and technicians take the Taiwan model overseas, first to the Republic of Vietnam, and then to over a dozen African nations. Chapter 6 returns to land reform, where I look at how Taiwanese land economists repurpose and recast land reform as evidence of the Republic of China's hybrid capitalist socialist approach to development. And finally, Chapter 7 discusses Taiwan's attempt to co-opt the global green revolution through nutritional science and vegetables, and ends the narrative with a kind of fall of development against the dual headwinds of Taiwan's international exclusion and neoliberalism. So for today's talk, I'm going to draw primarily upon the middle two chapters, chapters 4 and 5, which will explore Taiwan's missions to the Global South. But I'd be happy to talk about the other chapters in Q&A. So I'm going to start with a comparison of two articles, both from Time magazine, spaced 60 years apart. The first one is this one, published in 2022 by historian Chris Miller, author of Chip War, who wrote, "Chips make Taiwan the center of the world." And of course, this is a reference to semiconductors, of which 90% of the most advanced semiconductors are manufactured by TSMC, Taiwanese firm. Going back 60 years earlier to 1962, we'll see very similar headlines in Time magazine, except it's not about semiconductors. What positions Taiwan as the center of the world is pineapples and mushrooms. The story of Taiwan's economic growth is well known, having achieved miraculous growth in the post-war period from 1949 through the 1990s. But what's less well known is that that growth has an underlying miracle in Taiwan's agriculture. Rice yields, for example, mirrored the same growth curve that we see in Taiwan's GDP. After all, for most of its history, Taiwan was an agrarian economy. At the end of World War II, agricultural commodities accounted for over 80% of Taiwan's exports. At one point in 1934, when Taiwan was a Japanese colony, Taiwan was the third largest exporter of sugar in the world. During the Cold War, I argue that agriculture, and not industry, became the standard bearer for Taiwan's economic miracle for the rest of the world. And so my book, on one level, is a history of the rise and fall of agricultural development, which I'll argue is key for Taiwan's economic growth. But on another level, the book is also a history of modern Taiwan, a history of how the ruling Kuomintang authoritarian government legitimized its rule through development by rendering development as a form of what science and technology scholars Shaila Jasanoff and Sung-Hyun Kim call a socio-technical imaginary, where technical systems powerfully shape social and national identities. This imaginary was not just national in scope either. Taiwanese agricultural technicians and scientists were dispatched to Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, turning the Taiwanese development project from a national one to a global one. By doing so, Taiwanese state planners positioned Taiwan as leading a vanguard of decolonizing nation states. It was precisely because the world implied grander scales of leadership that Taiwan's position in the global vanguard was so compelling as a socio-technical imaginary. To help explain why agriculture was important to understanding economic growth, I turn to perhaps the most well-known agronomist in Taiwan's history, and that's Li Denghui, who was also Taiwan's first freely elected president. In the 1960s, Li Denghui was a doctoral student in agricultural economics studying at Cornell. He wrote his dissertation on what was called intersectoral capital flows, almost 400 pages. This meant that the capital required for industrialization, which after all was the main goal of modernization, came from the agricultural sector. It had to come from the agricultural sector. And that the agricultural sector required development first in order to generate the capital necessary to then fuel industrial takeoff. Several chapters of the book, as I mentioned, discuss land reform, which I won't go into in depth here, but I just want to touch on briefly to give you an idea, a sense of what Taiwan's agrarian's development content was like. The Kuomintang mandated redistributive land reform beginning in the early 1950s, forcing the sales of lands from large landowners in Taiwan to tenant farmers. In contrast with land reform elsewhere in the world, Taiwanese planners proudly marketed that their land reform was both capitalist and attentive to the welfare of landless farmers who tilled the lands. Taiwanese land economists invoked so-called father of the nation, Sun Yat-sen, one of his three principles of the people, 民生主义, often translated as the people's principle of welfare, that was portrayed as superior to and subsuming the lesser ideologies of socialism and communism. In the KMT narrative, the capitalist elements of Taiwan's land reform unleashed the full potential of land, thus deeply rooting their narrative in the modernizing language of finance and of rule of law. The KMT-led land reform transferred land, which was illegible to the central state, with its mixed grades, productivities, topographies, and usufruct land rights, instead to capital as productive, quantified, rationalized, transferable, represented through land contracts and bonds and other modern financial and legal instruments. KMT-led land reform transformed land leading proponents of land reform like Premier Chen Sen championed the clever usage of new financial instruments like bonds issued by the state that were then used to help facilitate the sales of lands from landlords to tenant farmers. So as a large landowner when your land was confiscated, you were given compensation as state bonds. Compensation was also issued to former landowners with stock certificates in state-owned enterprises. And so the goal of this in particular was to turn former, what were considered feudal landlords almost, into modern industrial capitalists as depicted here. So here are former landlords taking part in a shareholder meeting from one of the new shares in the SOEs that they've acquired. But what wasn't openly revealed in this land reform narrative to the rest of the world was that the Kuomintang carried out land reform not just to create this kind of capitalist utopia, but also to eliminate the power of the large landowners by taking away their land, whom they perceived as a threat to their new regime and their political power, in essence, consolidating the Kuomintang's grip over rural society while also simultaneously increasing their state capacity and economic base. So on the other side of agrarian development is the championing of modern science and technology. And this is perhaps best represented through high-yield crop cultivars like IR8, which is shown here on the left. IR8 was one of these miracle crops that were developed out of the International Rice Research Institute in Los Baños in the Philippines, and was one of these new cereal crops that were distributed all across the world to the Philippines, to India, to Vietnam. IR8 was a cross between two parent varieties, which are shown in the middle and in the right there. One was a fast-growing Indonesian variety called Peta, and that's the very tall variety that you see here. On the right-hand side is a semi-dwarfing cultivar called DGWG, or Dijiaojian, which contained a very key gene, the SD1 allele, which was a semi-dwarfing gene that was necessary for the IR8 to inherit the characteristics of semi-dwarfing that allowed it to concentrate growth into the rice grain, as well as to resist toppling over, which the Peta variety was subject to. Both the modern science and technology and the social elements of Taiwan's agrarian development underscored how Taiwan presented its experience as a model for the rest of the world to emulate. And that's where I'll turn to now. As early as the 1950s, Taiwan's success in agriculture began to draw attention from other countries on an international stage. One of the first was from the Republic of Vietnam. So like the Republic of China, the Republic of Vietnam, or the RVN, was embroiled in a war against communism. RVN leader, Diem, was a fellow anti-communist leader from the perspective of Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the ROC. And Chiang believed that through this kind of fellow anti-communist leader, he found a fellow ally and an important partner in what Chiang Kai-shek imagined to be a new Asian anti-communist alliance. From the Vietnamese side, Vietnamese planners looked outward for models of development that they could follow to build up the Vietnamese national economy, to help fund its military to fight communism, while also providing a social structure to combat the influence of communism across the rural areas. As early as 1949, officials in the state of Vietnam, which preceded the RVN, began to take note of agricultural development strategies in the Republic of China. State of Vietnam planners were particularly interested in one institution in the ROC, and that was the Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, Nong Phu Hui. Established in the Republic of China when it was still on the mainland in 1948, and followed the move of the Kuomintang government across the strait to Taiwan in 1949, where it then became the key government institution responsible for implementing agricultural policy in Taiwan. Republic of Vietnam planners followed with deep interest in the policies that JCR was carrying out in Taiwan. And one of these was the organization and the control over farmers' associations in Taiwan, which had been an important part of state control over rural areas dating back to the Japanese colonial era and continued under the Kuomintang. This document from 1958 from the Republic of Vietnam shows how RVN planners took particular interest in not just the social structure that encouraged agricultural growth, but also the social structure that granted the state greater state capacity over rural areas. Furthermore, in contrast with the United States, Taiwan was an Asian country that was starting from similar kind of humble colonial roots, that the ROC was seeking to build a modern nation without access to the vast coffers or to the already built up economies that Western powers already had. And so in 1959, through an introduction from a US agricultural official who had formerly worked in Taiwan as part of JCRR, was later sent to the RVN as part of the US mission to Vietnam, advised his Vietnamese counterparts to create Taiwanese-styled farmers' associations modeled after JCRR. And so this launched Taiwan's first formal international development mission. Over the course of over a dozen years, from 1959, from that very first mission, to 1972, Taiwanese agricultural teams were deployed to over 26 provinces in the Republic of Vietnam. Taiwanese experts assisted Vietnam in establishing rural social organizations, such as 4T clubs, which were the Vietnamese equivalent of 4-H clubs, which were actually first exported from, as many of you know, the American heartland by American development officials to rural Taiwan. And then from there, from rural Taiwanese officials into rural Vietnam. Taiwanese agricultural teams introduced new high-yielding crop varieties to Vietnam. Pictured here is the Dixie Queen variety of watermelon imported from the United States and compared with the native and much smaller Vietnamese indigenous variety. Images like this, which were showcased across Taiwanese development publications, illustrated one of the visual elements of Taiwan's portrayal of its success, often through depictions of verdant, lush landscapes that had been transformed under Taiwanese development expertise, or even more direct comparisons such as this one, showcasing Taiwanese introduced crops versus local varieties. Taiwanese agricultural teams also portrayed their ability to use simple tools to achieve modern agricultural practices. So here you see a Taiwanese technician on the right-hand side assisting a Vietnamese farmer to maintain consistent spacing in transplanting rice into rice paddies. Compared to US techniques that relied on power tillers and other forms of mechanization, Taiwanese practitioners preferred to emphasize simpler forms of technology, human-powered implements like this one, that better suited lower budgets that were one of the limitations of other Global South nations. Rural social organizing extended to households as well, and to along gendered lines. Women were engaged in handicrafts, as was typical in 1950s-styled home economics. One of my oral history interviewees, who was a technician who worked in a Taiwanese agricultural team in Vietnam in the 1960s, relayed to me that many of the Vietnamese villages that he worked in were populated mostly by women, and that was because of most of the men being drawn to fight in the ongoing war. And so the gendered phenomenon of development also continues in the Taiwanese missions. An important aspect of Taiwanese agricultural development work was agricultural extension, and this is the practice of disseminating modern agricultural practices to rural areas through demonstration plots where you would have a piece of land and you demonstrate the newest and best technologies and varieties, and also through training into rural areas, which is what's depicted here. My oral history interviewee explained how in the evenings, Taiwanese technicians would take time to go out to the various areas that they were responsible for and would hold classes very much like this one, where they would just have the Vietnamese locals sit down and they would introduce new varieties and how best to plant them for Vietnamese audiences. As we'll see as a theme that recurs throughout Taiwanese development, especially in Africa, one of the motifs is that Taiwanese technicians and scientists worked side by side with farmers from developing countries. So this photo at the very, at the left of the photo is National Taiwan University professor of plant science. And here he's pictured, kind of pant leg rolled up, sleeves rolled up in the rice paddies, shoulder to shoulder, with farmers from Vietnam. And so here we have an example of the portrayal that Taiwanese development expertise was in the trenches and willing to get its hands dirty along with farmers from the developing world. Taiwanese missions were present in Vietnam for over a dozen years, all the way until the fall of Saigon and the end of the RVN. Even though its presence was cut short in this instance, Taiwanese missions in Vietnam demonstrated for Taiwan that its development expertise was valued, not just for its perceived benefits to the recipient nation, but also for Taiwan's own Cold War ambitions of fighting communism and for its anti-communist alliance building. By the 1960s, these political goals of development had become increasingly important as the Republic of China faced a looming crisis. After its retreat to Taiwan at the end of the Communist Revolution in 1949, the Kuomintang regime under Chiang Kai-shek had always vowed to retake the mainland, 反攻大陆. But by the 1950s, it became important that their hopes of ousting the communists from the mainland were becoming increasingly dim. And thus, this was threatening one of the KMT's core political ideologies, the idea that one day they can return to the mainland. Internationally, the People's Republic of China sought to replace the Republic of China for the seat of China in the United Nations. And so this is a classified document from the US State Department that is guessing at how nations in the United Nations would vote for the ouster of the ROC. What changed the calculus of the UN vote, which at first favored the ROC, was the wave of decolonizing nations, mostly from Africa, that began to vote in the UN and shift the tide of votes toward the PRC's favor. And what this did was it sparked a diplomatic war between the ROC and the PRC to build diplomatic relations with many of these new decolonized African states. Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs thus began a new initiative to win influence in Africa and later Latin America and Southeast Asia called Operation Vanguard, which is how I derived the title of my book. Operation Vanguard marked what I would argue is a critical turn in the nation building and the colonial project of the Kuomintang in Taiwan, and that is a turn towards the Global South. By portraying their development diplomacy as magnanimous and a humanitarian project designed to help other colonial peoples, or former colonial peoples, follow the footsteps of Taiwan to wealth, power, and modernity, the Kuomintang regime intended to portray itself as leading a global vanguard of developing nations. The person who perhaps best personified this turn to the Global South was this man, Yang Xi-kun, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in charge of Africa. Yang Xi-kun was popularly known in Taiwanese media and newspapers as Fei Zhou Xianzhen, Mr. Africa, known for his adept political connections to the leaders of these newly decolonized states in Africa. Yang saw these new African states as potential allies who could vote to support the ROC in the United Nations. Within public diplomacy and representations of Taiwanese development, Taiwanese planners favored a discourse of commonality and solidarity with African nations. So this is the cover of a 1962 issue of Free China Review, which is an English language publication of the ROC government. And it highlights an early instance of ROC African cooperation. Here you see Malagasy Republic President Philibert Tsiranana sitting on a brand new bright orange or bright red power tiller produced by Taiwanese manufacturer Zhongguo Nongji. The article praises Tsiranana. It valorizes his rural origins and explains that he is, quote, long on horse sense and short on impetuous bluster. Highlighting the rural roots of Tsiranana, I argue, links him and the Taiwanese imaginings of their own positionality vis-a-vis the Malagasy Republic, centered on an agrarian and rural identity. With the power tiller, though, Taiwan was not just protecting ruralness, it was also projecting modernity, notably Taiwan's recent success at agricultural technology. Indeed, Taiwanese development experts were careful to portray themselves in the same historical narrative as post-colonial African states. Race was not explicitly raised, but commonality was coded in other ways, such as through common rural backgrounds, through the same search for post-colonial nation building, and the search for economic growth and living standards, especially through alternatives to Western-dominated discourses. Throughout Operation Vanguard, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs invited African technicians to visit Taiwan. These state-sanctioned visits were ostensibly for the purposes of learning, but became carefully choreographed performances of what Taiwanese experts wanted to portray to the Global South. So for example, in this tour in 1962, African agricultural technicians were given quote unquote Taiwan hats, which you'll see them wearing there, again, emphasizing a common rural class background and a shared practicality or pragmatism of Taiwanese technology. Taiwanese were eager to showcase, in particular for the African audience, this idea of an ethos of hard work and a willingness to get their hands dirty in the trenches. This image shows an instance of what I like to call the Taiwanese MacGyvering of agricultural technology, which is without the use of a tripod that this Taiwanese technician might have access to if he were in Taiwan. Instead, he utilizes a very common everyday object, a stool, in order to perform his land surveys. And this is a point of pride that I noticed across many of my oral history interviews of technicians who went to Africa. Many of them had photo albums of their work in Vietnam, and one of them was just an album of all the different kinds of agricultural implements that this one technician was able to fashion out of everyday objects like oil barrels and other forms of things that they had lying around in order to accomplish modern agricultural practices. Another motif was learning while doing, 做中学习, again, emphasizing a willingness to work in the trenches, making technology accessible and practical for farmers, while also emphasizing the pragmatism of learning and practicing technologies by doing. And finally, there's this image, which when I first saw this image, I thought of the kind of classic colonial imagery of Western colonial administrators depicted with indigenous peoples from across the colonized worlds. But I think that this image is a little bit different. So notice, for example, that the Taiwanese technicians on the right who are called Chinese farmers in this instant, were depicted in a different form of dress. So they're bare-chested. They're wearing work trousers or jeans. One of them has a baseball cap. And I think this is on purpose. Taiwanese planners of Operation Vanguard, in searching for technicians to work abroad, purposely recruited graduates of agricultural vocational schools, nongxiao, which were technical schools that targeted the less educated rural populations of Taiwan. This particular imagery utilizes a different visuality and a language of post-coloniality, one that I think emphasizes a common class and rural background, even though behind the imagery, I think there's still a difference and an asymmetry in power, an asymmetry in the benefits received that still benefited the Taiwanese more so than the African farmers. And so I'd argue that this is more reminiscent of an imperial imaginary than one of equality and solidarity. The final section that I want to highlight is how the high modernist science complements pragmatism and perseverance of Taiwanese missions. So in 1965, Taiwan hosts an agricultural science conference called the Sino-African Agricultural Technical Cooperation Conference in Côte d'Ivoire. At this conference, leading Taiwanese agricultural scientist and head of the Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, Shen Zonghan, expounded upon two subjects in a speech. One was Taiwan's agricultural success and its consequences for economic growth and well-being, and the other was the potential of African nations to follow the footsteps of Taiwan to achieve that very same success. Graphs like this were presented. So this is the growth curve that seems like a familiar shape to you, and I showed you at the beginning of my talk. But in the 1960s, when Shen Zonghan was showing this graph to his African audiences, this was something that was new. It was something that was being deployed in a fashion that would later become important for Taiwan's development goals. That is, demonstrating the importance of Taiwanese developments through its manifest success. Additional charts showed rice yields per hectare, agricultural exports, and this one, which shows Taiwan's daily nutrient intake compared to other nations in the global north and global south. Sun Zonghan, at this point in his speech, enticed his African audiences, arguing that Taiwan was not an outlier, but rather as a model for Africa to emulate. He told his audience that Taiwan's ecology was only moderately endowed, and sub-Saharan Africa possessed much of the similar climate and soil that Taiwan does. Sun told his African audiences that Africa, quote, possesses the fundamental conditions to build a strong and prosperous nation, end quote. He implied that with Taiwan's help to increase research and improve agricultural techniques, quote, each African ally's future would be limitless. Even though Sun Zonghan, Yang Xikun, and other architects of Taiwan's development engagement with the world explicitly had in mind a Global South audience, ironically, perhaps the longest lasting effects of Taiwan's development abroad was not in the Global South, but rather in Taiwan. I argue that Taiwan's modernity as performed through these development missions also shaped how Taiwanese at home understood themselves as modern and as occupying the vanguard of the developing world. Of course, the background to all of this was the Taiwanese experience under the KMT was characterized by state terror, beginning with the violent repression of Taiwanese protesters following the February 28th uprising of 1947. After the 228 incident, the Kuomintang utilized military-backed violence and discipline to instill fear and suspicion among the Taiwanese population. I argue that the Kuomintang eventually adopted a carrot and stick approach, so a carrot to complement that stick. The complement was development. Development came to represent the bona fides of the authoritarian regime, allowing broader Taiwanese society to unite around the government's expertise and global leadership in modern science and technology. One example where we see this clearly is in the newspaper Yuandong Ribao, which was a Chinese language newspaper published not in Taiwan, but in Cholum, in Saigon, in the Republic of Vietnam. Yuandong Ribao targeted the overseas Chinese population, which was a key constituency that the ROC claimed legitimacy and rule over. Indeed, development was important for a home audience too in Taiwan. This is from Harvest magazine, Fengnian Zazhi, which was one of the major agricultural extension publications published by the government starting in the 1950s. And although Harvest magazine was mostly about extending knowledge, it was to complement the practice of agricultural extension, you also see these kinds of politicized news reports that explain to a home audience what Taiwan was doing abroad. And so here we have, on the left-hand side, a news report of a very well-publicized death of a Taiwanese agricultural technician, Zhang Du-sen, in 1963. Now, in Harvest magazine and in other state-controlled media, newspapers, magazines, Zhang Du-sen was represented not just as a martyr of the Cold War, so someone who died fighting communism, as one might expect, but also as a martyr of development. His death became a national symbol of what the Republic of China was doing elsewhere in the world, as a great nation to benefit other peoples. Taiwanese farmers reading Harvest understood that Zhang Du-sen was in Vietnam sharing modern Taiwanese agricultural practices, reflecting Taiwan's place in a vanguard of developing nations. Now, as I reach my conclusion, Sunila gave me an excellent suggestion to read a part of the book. And so I think that's what I'll do. So I'm going to read 3 paragraphs from the introduction. I know it's the introduction, not the conclusion, but I think it'll make sense once I start reading. If you are joining from online, you have access to the book. I'm going to start reading from page 4, so the first full paragraph. And I think this helps to bring together many of the themes of my talk for this conclusion. Scholars have previously sought to understand and explain how to replicate Taiwan's success from the perspectives of institutions, policies, or materiality. However, I'm ultimately concerned or interested in the consequences of development for society. Development began as a state project to modernize rural communities and achieve higher production yields, while also inculcating state power into societal structures. In Taiwan, development also rendered a new social imaginary based on technical and scientific modernity, capitalism with elements of social welfare, and the gravity of economic growth. To illustrate with one powerful visual image, by the 1970s, the growth curve became a recurring motif of the Taiwan Miracle. Deployed in conferences like the SAATCC and in front of scientists from Africa, Asia, and the Americas, growth in the developing world became equated with Taiwan. From there, the Kuomintang regime invoked the growth curve along with images of luscious, green, verdant Taiwanese vegetables, transplanted into the fields of Vietnam, and with Taiwanese technicians planting rice side by side with African villagers for Taiwanese in the metropole. Through the farmers' associations that helped make the Taiwan model an attraction for third world bureaucrats, the Kuomintang translated a new visual and documentary narrative of their success abroad. Through state-disseminated propaganda, pro-government media, and color films, Taiwanese farmers in the countryside and urban city dwellers in Taipei understood that Taiwanese rice and technicians were benefiting peoples at all corners of the world, a reflection of the modernity, perseverance, and expertise of their nation as a whole. Agrarian development became an instrument of state power, a hegemonic discourse that state leaders and ROC elites on Taiwan utilized to shape societal behaviors and further their own political ends. Anthropologist Arturo Escobar calls development a type of colonization of reality, where, quote, certain representations become dominant and shape indelibly the ways in which reality is imagined and acted upon, end quote. Throughout the decades, the content of development changed, from famine prevention to land reform to vegetable breeding. What remained constant was the deployment of development for state building, diplomacy, or to sustain an authoritarian martial law regime. ROC leaders emphasized Taiwan was actively pioneering development, not just for its own society, but for the benefit of others. Taiwan, they implied, was leading the vanguard. In government circles of the ROC Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the United States, this was explicit. Beginning in the early 1960s, Taiwanese agricultural development missions were collectively referred to as Operation Vanguard. It was a clever moniker for a diplomatic initiative, but it also reflects the ROC's broader effort to position itself as a global leader in development. The role of the state in creating a social imaginary for political purposes is a theme common to studies of Taiwanese society, in part because the Kuomintang government's authoritarian leverage over politics and education that granted hegemony over discourse. As science, technology, and society scholars like Sheila Jasanoff, Sung-Yoon Kim, and Aaron Moore have argued, technological systems can powerfully shape society and social identities. The socio-technical imaginary and meaning of agrarian development as leading the world proved powerful for the ROC national project. Taiwan's imagination of the vanguard cannot be understood without a global frame. From 1959 onward, Taiwan sent agrarian development missions to nearly all corners of the developing world, South and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. This turn to the global followed the emergence of post-colonial politics, wherein states of the developing world attempted to locate alternatives to Western-dominated discourses of knowledge. Taiwanese state planners, scientists, and social scientists seized an opening in this global moment by assembling aspects of Taiwan's recent agricultural, rural, and economic success into what they suggested was an exportable model, evoking principles of low capital costs, scientific modernism, and an ethos of perseverance and non-Western solidarity. The Taiwanese model, its practitioners argued, was more applicable to developing states than capitalist or communist models. Newspapers, speeches, and media in the ROC valorized Taiwanese development experts abroad, and the sustained demand for Taiwanese methods and experts helped the ROC claim that it was at the global vanguard of development modernity. The global became an expansive metaphor for the imagination of Taiwan in the vanguard. It was precisely because the world implied grand scales of leadership that Taiwan's position in a global vanguard was so compelling as an imaginary. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. I've really been enjoying reading your superb book, which I recommend for people to purchase and read. But it's really just a different kind of pleasure to hear an author speak about their work, especially one that's just been published. So thank you. I thought I would start by asking you to take a couple of steps back and tell us about the origins and motivations for this. I mean, so much of the emphasis, both in the scholarly world and also the popular imagination of East Asian economic dynamism and development in the second half of the 20th century, has been trained on manufacturing and industry. So what led you to the countryside?
Yeah, so I can tell you all a little bit about how I came to this project. So this was when I was an MA student at Columbia, and I was looking for kind of what I would write about in my seminar papers, and eventually, hopefully, an idea for PhD applications to history programs. And so I started with local archives, as historians mostly do. And I was actually really interested in as you said, economic development from the perspective of industry. And so I went to the Ford Foundation archives, which were the closest archives I could find. That was Midtown Manhattan back then. So before they moved to upstate to the Rockefeller Archive Center. And I just asked the archivist for kind of keyword search Taiwan development. And I found a really interesting archival document about this institution in Taiwan that was trying to spread, I think it was like broccoli rabe or some sort of vegetable to Africa, basically extolling the values of Taiwanese bred vegetables in terms of minerals, vitamins, and basically for the health of modern societies. And that was from the Asian Vegetable Research and Development Center, which eventually became the central institution in the final chapter of the book. But it was the first document that I found about agricultural development. And I thought, broccoli rabe is so much more interesting than like manufacturing and heavy industry. So I just started to trace like the history of the AVRDC, and then I got to JCRR, and then I went back all the way back to tracing the intellectuals who were behind JCRR. So folks like Jiang Mengling, to the Republican period in China. And so I went backwards in time, and that became the book.
That's great, and fantastic for the grad students in the audience to hear how projects can come to be from kind of chance encounters. So I wanted to ask you about the range of archives that you've used, just because from the sections of it that I've read and hearing you talk, you reference archives all over the world. So what was the process of getting access? How did you find the archives that you would use? Are there archives that you would really like to get to that you weren't able to get to?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I spent, this was my doctoral dissertation turned into a book. So I spent almost 2.5 years doing field work. And during that period, the first like 14 months or so were spent in Taiwan. And for that, I was mostly at, Taiwan is kind of unique. There are lots of historians of China who are now kind of moving to Taiwanese history because the archives are totally open. You just need a passport and you just sign up in the sign-up sheet. And you can access most of the archives in Taiwan without any kind of, you don't need a letter of introduction. You don't need any kind of, anything beyond some sort of identification. And so I spent most of my early field work in the Taiwanese archives, and I was tracing the kind of government institutions like JCRR. And the second half of my field work, I spent about 10 months in the rest of the world. So first I went to Washington, DC, and I spent about 6 months living near College Park and going to NARA. So a lot of the US archives are important. And then I went to the Philippines. That didn't end up so much in the book. I kind of de-emphasized that aspect of the Asian Development Bank, which is where I went. And the Asian Development Bank, I'm not an anthropologist, but that was kind of like my first anthropological experience where like you step off the public transportation, which is just, in the Philippines, it's really crowded. And right when you step off, there are, unfortunately unhoused people on the streets. And then you walk through these like huge white walls and like double sets of gates to enter into the Asian Development Bank. And you're in this like Western institution in the middle of, this urban environment. And I remember I there's like a Starbucks in the lobby with like an atrium and a foyer and skylights, and there were these economists next to me talking about economist stuff that I don't understand. So that was an experience doing the archival research. But my favorite was probably Vietnam, where I got perspectives from Vietnamese planners, which I think was really important for chapter 4. And for that, I utilized Research Assistant because I don't read Vietnamese. And I'm very thankful for several of my Vietnamese history colleagues from Berkeley who helped me out a lot in terms of the translation. And I even arranged, like Simon Toner, who's a historian of Vietnam, we kind of did an exchange where I helped him read Chinese language documents, he helped me read Vietnamese language documents, so we kind of did an exchange there. So there are different ways that you can utilize multinational archives to support a project like this. That's probably my advice for the graduate students, is that you can have different creative ways to do kind of these kinds of projects. Yeah, that's great. Your description of the ease of doing research in Taiwan, I think, has convinced probably scholars of South Asia in particular that maybe we should all become Taiwan experts. The Taiwan field welcomes everyone. Because archives are not so simple to access in India. So you talked about, like, I'm really convinced by everything that I've read, and this idea of exporting science and technology, which was really what the Taiwanese project was, left out the first step, arguably, or a core step of the project, which was land reform, land redistribution, land to the tiller. I like the title of that a lot, executing contracts and not landlords. But that piece of it, was there an effort on the part of the Taiwanese vanguard to sort of encourage those kinds of more structural transformations in the places that they took their model to? Or did they just understand that that was not a possibility? Yeah, and so they didn't. And so that's why I make the arguments. So chapter 2 talks about land reform as it was practiced, and then how it became re-narrativized. So basically how it became told as history in the Kuomintang's kind of official government representation, which really focused on its kind of financial wizardry, financial magic. And then chapter 6, which is on the Land Reform Training Institute, then looks at how that narrative was deployed in pedagogy for training third world bureaucrats who are going to Taiwan and trying to learn Taiwanese land reform. And it's so interesting to look at the, today there's a group of kind of like revisionist historians of Taiwan who are going through kind of really local records and looking at how this really pretty and dressed up narrative of land reform actually had a lot of violence and forced redistribution behind it, and also a lot of exploitation, because a lot of landlords who took state-owned enterprise stocks sold them immediately at a loss because they didn't understand what stocks were, and they were like, what is this? It's a piece of paper. And many of them utilized the black market to regain some of their land holdings. And so really it's really a dressed up narrative. In the LRTI, in the Land Reform Training Institute, we see how the real selling point of land reform for a Western audience, and especially for the Americans, was land to the tiller, so forced redistribution. But what was taught to third world bureaucrats was not forced redistribution. It was things like cadastral surveys, land tax policy, things that were technical in nature and that didn't cross into the realm of politics, as James Ferguson famously says. These are apolitical endeavors in land reform. And that's not the land reform that happened in Taiwan in the 1950s. And so you can see that through the translation for pedagogy for a third world audience. You can see that development really is about performance as much as it is about the actual structural change. I think that so much so, I think that I'd consider them to be two separate things, and that international development is really about that performance and about that imagination more than it is about the kinds of practices that you need, because you can't really export that. I have more questions, but I think I should probably open this up and let other folks ask their questions. So maybe we can take a few questions from those here, and I encourage anyone who's watching online to post their questions in the chat window.
We have a couple on Facebook.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Yes.
Thank you, James. Such a wonderful talk. I learned so much. And I want to know more about your oral history materials and how that sort of fits in with your book. So what did you learn from your oral history interviews, and how did you find the interviewees? That is sort of complements the more official archival sources. And I asked that question because I'm an anthropologist who accidentally sort of ventured into the history of Taiwan, and my kind of project going on, I wanted to do more oral history interview to complement the sort of archival data I gathered recently on education, 教育研究院, the 图书馆 in Taipei. But this is kind of my first attempt to do oral history interview. Always feel insecure, I'm not asking them about their here and now as my ethnographic work, as more sort of conventionally focused on. So I want to learn from historians. How do you structure that, and how do you sort of incorporate oral history into the more kind of conventional historiography?
Yeah, I mean, really, as an anthropologist, you are the expert. I mean, historians do oral history, and I think there's like an oral history association with a set of standards for how to best to do oral history. But I would say that a lot of those standards are not so different from what anthropologists do when you do ethnography. But I can tell you about how I did this for my project. So when I wrote the dissertation, I don't believe I had any oral history in it. And so it was brought up to me by many senior scholars as I was describing the project after I finished the dissertation, and many of them said, you really need to get a perspective, like a social perspective. And the official records from like JCRR, Ministry of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so these are the main governmental bureaus I was looking at, they didn't provide that perspective. Most of them were about policies, about the perspectives from the top looking downward. And so I thought about how could I get that social history perspective? And really the only way was to do oral histories. And so that's what I spent a lot of my time when I got here at UW, and I was using my research funding, was to find oral history interviewees. And that wasn't easy because many of the technicians are now in their 80s, 90s, and older. And so one of the sources I used was, the Nongji-tuan in Taiwanese history is almost like myth for a certain generation of Taiwanese. So that part of that is because of the government project to mythologize these missions. And so there's a lot of newspapers who have interviewed these retired technicians, and they're kind of superficial, but what you can get from them is names, and you can Google those names. And so that's what I did. And I also asked my mother to help me look at some of these names and like, how do I figure out how to contact these people? And Google's surprisingly powerful. Like you can find some of these people, maybe they're retired, but they continue to work in some sort of agriculture related field. And then you can reach out to them. And I just did, I think maybe 3 oral history trips where I went to different parts of Taiwan, and I interviewed many of these technicians who were already interviewed by newspaper journalists. And so they're very happy to talk to me. I even went to one where they had like almost like an alumni meeting, where they all meet together and they talk about, and it was actually kind of sad because they talked about some of the issues that they faced. Like for example, some of them had health issues that were a result of their work, and the government wasn't paying them for the kind of health issues that they were encountering. And so they were talking about how to organize and pressure the government to pay for more of that. And so being exposed to that was also like a transformation in my career, because I chose to become a historian because I don't like talking to people. And I really prefer reading about dead people. The deader, the better. So talking to living people was definitely an adjustment.
The only
for me.
kind you can talk to, actually.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, unless I have like a seance or something. Yeah, and that's not academically rigorous. Yeah, so that was a transformation. I learned a lot from doing oral history interviews, and I encourage other historians who are working on like more modern history. If you have access to people like the people I was interviewing, I think it does help, and it does make this book wouldn't be that book without those interviews.
Great question. Mark, there was a hand up in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what you're working on now.
So I'm going to repeat the question so that
right,
everyone
sorry.
can hear who's listening, who's watching online.
I should
So
remind you. Yeah.
Mark asked what you're working on now.
I'm not sure yet. So I'm thinking about a couple different projects. One is, one I've told you about, Mark, before, which is about capitalism in very contemporary Taiwan. So looking at like 1990s, 2000s, and Taiwan and global financial crises. The other project is more of like a popular history project about how Taiwan's marginalization in the international system maybe challenges Western notions of international rules-based order. And I'm still it's very preliminary. I mean, this has only just been published. So ask me again in 2 years, 3 years?
Maybe one more question from the audience, and then we'll switch to a few online. Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hi, James. This is a very wonderful talk. I might have 3 questions, but I may make them short. The first is about the combination or conflict between the Japanese agricultural policies in colonial time to the KMT policies. Is there any continuation of that or inheritance of organization, like you said, about Farmers Association that makes these projects, the KMT project, more successful from your observation? That's one. And the second is, I'm really curious about why the ROC at the time chose Africa as the export agricultural technician, support. Why not Latin America? Why not other places that are considered less developed? What is the reason to take Africa as your archive shows? And the third question, sorry, because this is a very rich talk, and I think there, like you said from the previous question, there are some parallel or differences from the social oral history, considering how people think about the land reform issue. I think you might read the book written by Winnie, 江湖在哪里, which is a newer publication about the reaction of the farmers to the policies. And they actually had a lot of resentment onto those land to till, or getting like the grain for fertilizers. The government forced the farmers to get the fertilizer from abroad just to have a set price for their grains. And have you encountered any discussion about that? Thank you.
So those are 3 long questions. They started with a compliment for your book. But the first question was about continuities between Japanese agricultural policies during the period of Japanese colonization and KMT agricultural policies. The second question was about
I took notes.
Why Africa? Okay, and the third was about resentment that oral histories might reveal that other methods might not reveal.
Thank you, Ita, for the question. So yes, the KMT continued the Japanese agricultural policies. I think some of them were really, really key. So for example, the farmers associations were established under Japanese colonial rule. They were an instrument of rural social control. It was how the Japanese colonial state controlled rural areas, was through the farmers associations. And the KMT utilized them very effectively. That was, how they were so capable of extending their control into the countryside, was by grafting onto those pre-existing institutions. The KMT, of course, downplayed the Japanese influence. I mean, there's basically no mention of Japan on their influence in Taiwan, despite the fact that it was very much important. The ROC chooses Africa for political reasons. The UN vote, that was the overriding diplomatic objective of the ROC in the 1960s, was we must preserve our seat in the United Nations above anything else. And so you can see the shift in diplomatic strategy over time reflects, in development, reflects diplomacy priorities over time. So in the 1950s, it's about anti-communism and building anti-communist alliances. So that's Vietnam. In the 60s, once African countries enter the UN, then Africa takes over as the central focus. after 1971, when Taiwan is kicked out of the UN, Africa loses its focus and Latin America becomes the main focus by the 1980s, because that's where you have all of the kind of anti-communist, right-wing governments. And that's where the ROC is finding a lot of alliances in Central and South America. So I argue that you can trace that kind of correlation. Chapter 3 talks about the fertilizer barter system, which is the very exploitative form of taxation that the KMT imposes upon farmers in Taiwan. So basically, if you're a farmer in Taiwan, you need fertilizer to grow crops. You can't purchase fertilizer in the open market. It has to be acquired through the Farmers Association, and the ratio that you pay is set by the state. And it's not a free market ratio. It's much more favorable to the state. You need to have fertilizer. You pay with basically the grain that you produce. That grain then feeds the military. So at this point, I think about 10% of Taiwan's GDP goes to the military, which is the highest in the world at that point. And so I argue that this is a form of food system control that feeds the ROC military machine. And so chapter 3 goes into that.
But I think the point is such an interesting one too, that you wouldn't necessarily, because the official records don't reveal it, it would only, really that has to come from a different kind of historical inquiry, which would involve talking to living people.
Yeah, and that's how the land reform chapter started, because I didn't know, I only read Chen Chen's Land Reform in Taiwan. I thought this was how it was, and people like Joe Studwell have also only read that and don't know. And so Joe Studwell is the famous book about how Asia works, and he has a very rose-colored
hat view.
Yeah, basically he buys the KMT narrative without any criticism. And so it wasn't until I read the revisionist historians Tu Di Zheng Yi was one of the books that I read, Land Justice, that I realized that actually there is, much like a lot of Taiwanese history, there's this kind of unofficial narrative that you only get to if you look at history against the grain. And so that really influenced that chapter. And I owe a lot to these revisionist historians.
We have a couple of questions that have come in through Facebook.
And also YouTube. I'll pull it up for you.
And then that as well. But I'm going to start with the ones that are on Facebook. James, thank you so much for your book talk. Do you see differences between the ROC and the PRC experience in providing development assistance to countries in Asia and Africa? Does ROC post-coloniality and technical modernity differ from PRC socialist brotherhood, as discussed by Jamie Monson in work on PRC experts in Tanzania in the 1970s?
Yeah, so surprisingly, the framing of development from the ROC is almost identical to the framing of development from the PRC. So they both emphasized, solidarity. They emphasized commonality, common world background. They emphasized practicality, hard work, and pragmatism. And those are identical across the PRC and the ROC. There's not a lot of work on PRC agriculture in Africa. I think probably just Deborah Brautengam, which is more contemporary. But even in the contemporary period, the PRC continues to utilize the very same kinds of language and discourse. Jamie Monson's book is probably the best. That's on infrastructure, so about the Tazara Railroad, and the emphasis on labor, on doing the hard work that's required to build these railroads. So it's remarkably similar. And the main difference, of course, is which state you're supporting. And so you can see in the actual political outcome is that many of these African states would play the PRC and the ROC off of each other. They'd say you give me more money and I'll vote for you in the UN. And so they didn't really care too much about the content of the developments. So I think that just tells us something about development politics too, that what they cared about was what benefited them as opposed to the content of the development.
Yeah, super interesting. So there's one more question that's come in through Facebook. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how the agricultural aid experience in the 1960s is different from or similar to the contemporary experience of Taiwanese aid expertise in recent years.
Yeah, so Taiwan continues to do what's called, international development these days is called ODA, Overseas Development Assistance. It's mostly to official allies, so countries that continue to recognize Taiwan as the Republic of China diplomatically. And that's mostly limited to South Pacific nations and a handful of like Central American nations. So those missions mostly focus, as I understand, mostly focus on things that are scientific and technical in nature, but are relevant for those societies. So for example, South Pacific nations, I think, are dealing with public health crises of like diabetes and other kinds of public health issues. And so a lot of those missions are medical missions from Taiwan that are doctors and public health officials who are trying to combat the prevalence of diabetes in South Pacific nations. So these things continue, and they continue to be supporting diplomatic initiatives because South Pacific nations diplomatically recognize the ROC offers them these development missions in exchange to maintain that relationship. So in some ways, things haven't changed much.
Let's shift back to the live audience.
So, James, thank you. That was terrific. Do you wish you had done more with the idea of Taiwan staying as a global vanguard, using its aid as a way of winning support internationally? And that's manifested in some of the documentation you've looked at, where policymakers are very consciously talking about using aid as a way to win support. A more specific question, just like you linked up continuities between the Japanese and what Taiwan does, what ROC does later on, to what extent are these ideas also drawn from JCRR, right? Advice that the KMT kind of ignored when they were on the mainland, but once they come to Taiwan, a lot of the messages, a lot of the ideas that JCRR was promoting is picked up and developed.
Yeah. Do you want to repeat the? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the question was about the second.
To the foreign policy.
So the first question was the connection, the explicit connections between development and foreign policy. If you could speak a little bit more about that. And then the second question was about, how much of JCRR advice do Taiwanese experts ignore, and what do they take up? What do they take on?
Yeah, let me answer your second question first, Anand. So chapter 1 is about the Republican era, and I write that chapter because it explores the origins of many of these developmentalist ideas that become dominant in JCR in Taiwan. Some of them trace their lineage to some of the rural social movements in the Republican era. So for example, Yan Yangzu, Jimmy Yen's mass education movement. And this is an interesting story because Jimmy Yen is kind of, he expected to become chairman of JCRR in 1948. Jiang Mengling, who was the Minister of Education, was chosen over him. He took that as a personal affront, and so he left JCRR and he formed his own organization, which was called the, I forget what it was called, the Rural Reconstruction Institute or something. And then, so he goes to the Philippines, and this is Daniel Immerwahr's book. So you can see that there are elements of Jimmy Yen's approach, which really emphasize community development, an early instance of community development, which is focused on like village education, public health. And those elements did make it to JCRR. But JCRR also brought in other intellectual lineages that I think were more central to the Japanese colonial period. So for example, the emphasis on high-yielding crop cultivars, that was something that was present in China, but really the Japanese had done more in that area than the JCR did on the mainland. And so taking up those institutions of experiment stations and crop improvement was more, I think, attributable to the Japanese. But basically chapters 1 and 3 discuss the different intellectual lineages, the different institutional foundations, and I think how they converge together to form the Taiwan model. Yeah, so chapter 3, I think, is the one to read. On your first question, I think you framed it as like, done more, if...
Yeah, is there like explicit discussion of it in high policy circles? But let's use these techniques and this technology to advance a political agenda. So in the Global Vanguard, has a double meaning to it. There's this additional meaning to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's my interpretation as the kind of historian reading these documents against the grain, is I see this as a political project that the Taiwanese elite co-opted and leveraged to their advantage. I didn't find any like smoking gun policy documents in the archives. I think that those probably didn't make it into the archives. And I looked at a lot of documents. I think I used DevonThink to collect all the archival documents. So I took pictures of everyone, and then I keyworded, and then I OCR'd, and I put them into DevonThink. So I think I had over like 20,000 pages, and I couldn't find a single one that was like the smoking gun argument. But I found enough through like representation and cultural production media to, I think, at least for me, to convincingly make that argument in the book. And so that's what I based it upon. Oh yeah, let me open up YouTube for you. So I think there are a bunch of questions on YouTube.
Yeah. Okay, lots of congratulations and thank yous and compliments on the book. And then this question, I'm curious, how do you assess the extent to which Taiwan's development aid has been remembered or recognized in Vietnam and parts of Africa?
Yeah. So thank you, Mason, for this question. This is a good question. So for this, I didn't actually interview anyone in Vietnam or in Africa, but there is one scholar who did, Philip Liu Xiaopeng, and he wrote an article in, I think, China Quarterly about this, planting rice on the roof of the UN. And so he actually went to Africa, and he went to the sites that Taiwanese agricultural technicians were based in the 1960s. And he tried to find people to interview. And so he did find some people, and the results were quite interesting. Many of them remember the Taiwanese agricultural technicians. I think that their memories are somewhat mixed. I don't think that there is really a great long-term impact. They didn't really change the way in which they practice agriculture. Some of them remembered the Taiwanese agricultural teams as doing good things and trying to help out. Some of them remembered them as being there for only just a few years before the PRC team came in and took over. So you definitely see the diplomacy going on here. But I think what was perhaps most striking for me is the politics of all of this, that how you remember these development missions was really influenced by the political circumstances under which they were implemented. So many of these Taiwanese teams were small, they were relegated to small areas, they didn't have wide they didn't make structural changes, and they didn't have wide applicability. And so that was one of the limitations of development that I think I took to heart, and I think also emphasized influenced my larger arguments about what development was and its nature. Yeah, so definitely Liu Xiaopeng's article is the one to read if you're interested in seeing kind of oral histories of that.
Okay. Yeah, okay, here's a question that asks if you see these Cold War developmental projects resonate with the newer projects of the past 2 to 3 decades, such as the new southbound policy.
That's a really good question. I do. So the introduction, and I have an article coming out in Journal of Asia Studies about Taiwan as empire. In the introduction, I begin to make this argument that the socio-technical imaginary should be thought of as an imperial imaginary, because the ROC considered itself a great nation, and it utilized these development missions to benefit itself. Sure, it utilized the language of post-colonialism, of solidarity, and that we can all gain, but the advantage that was gained was really on the Taiwanese side. And I borrow this in part from the conception of Chen Guangxing in his book, Asia's Method. But I don't agree with him that Taiwan is a sub-empire. So he calls Taiwan a sub-empire, sub being kind of almost like secondary to US empire. And I don't think that's the right way to see this. I think that the ROC thought of itself as a great nation. It's the missions in which it sent to Africa, to Vietnam, the US provided clandestine funding, but it didn't dictate and it didn't control the content of those missions. And so the discourse, the practices, the technologies, all of that was from the Taiwanese side. And the benefit and the portrayal, the imaginary, was all created by the Taiwanese. And so one of the arguments that I draw there is that we should think about this as a form of an imperial imaginary from the ROC. Now, today, the ROC is massively transformed. You know, it's not, the ROC does not claim to be China anymore. Mostly, we've gone through Bentuhua, we've gone through Taiwanization. You know, Taiwan is Taiwan, it's not China, according to most Taiwanese. Does that still apply? I'm not quite sure. I think it still does, because I think that when Taiwan goes to Southeast Asia and goes to South Asia as part of this new southbound policy, they're still trying to extract some sort of gain out of that relationship, and they're still trying to utilize this very same language of, like, you know, common benefit, non-Western forms of economic and cultural exchange. And so I think there's some kernel of that there. And so in that regard, I kind of agree with Sun Guangxing's analysis of the southbound movement. So you can read that in the introduction. That's, I think, like page, I don't know what page number it is, but it's in the introduction, and also the forthcoming article in JSIS. And JSIS is really backed up, so I don't know when it'll be published, maybe 2 years from now or something.
Wow.
Yeah, it's already been, it's past peer review, so forthcoming.
Are there any questions from this audience?
Well, thank you, James, for the wonderful introduction to your book. So I was really intrigued by the one slide that you showed about the role of women in these kinds of visions for rural modernity. And so I want to ask if you can expand a little bit more about what vision that what vision was it for women in rural modernity, what role they had, so what exactly were they expected to do? And I would imagine that there are specific ideological bents to kind of the role of women in society and how it was being exported to these different cultures and societies.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Hajin. Oh, you should repeat
Oh yeah,
that.
so this was a question about the role of women in this rural modernity that was being imagined and then exported.
Yeah, I will tell you a funny story, which is that when I was at Berkeley, I heard from one of my other, so initially this dissertation was very like political history, diplomatic history, economic history. And I heard from one of my cohort members that I think it was Robin Einhorn, who's a historian of the United States, had told her graduate students, you cannot write a dissertation in history these days without covering race, class, or gender. And I thought about my dissertation, and I was like, I don't think I talk about any of those. And I was like, oh no, I've got to change this. So I think that mentioned, because I think that gender, race, which actually does show up in the Africa chapter, and class, which also shows up in the Africa chapter, become important lenses to read these documents against the grain. Because, you know, if you just read these documents, there's no mention of gender, and you just assume that this is like male-dominated enterprises, but that's not true. And so looking at the cultural spheres where I began to see how the gendered lens affected development. And so for this, I think it was chapter 3, where I focus on one particular documentary, which I found in Nara. This is called the Yu's 4-H Banner, and it's a documentary produced by JCRR along with, I think, like USIS, US Information Service, about 4-H in Taiwan. And there you really see the gendered elements, which is what I wanted to play up with that image from Vietnam too, which is that they're importing a lot of ideas about gender roles that were borrowed from the United States. So there's a wonderful book about gender and 4-H called the 4-H Harvest, which is kind of explaining what 4-H did in rural America through like a Foucauldian biopolitics and gendered lens, that the USDA was trying to train boys and girls at a very young age to perform gendered roles. And that was translated to Taiwan as well. So in this documentary, you see how, you know, women were expected to perform certain roles of pedagogy, teaching girls how to do handicrafts. And of course, it was totally gendered. It was only the women who were doing handicrafts. It was the boys who were doing like the mathematical quantitative recording. Although the girl assisted him in taking out the eggs to help quantify. So you do see how in the development model, certain ideas of what modern practices are done along gendered lines. Yeah, so chapter 3, I talk about that a little bit more.
Again, I'm going to shift back to online. So someone asks if you could speak a little bit more about the ROC's agricultural assistance in Africa compared to their assistance in other areas such as infrastructure building, as in Nigeria.
Yeah. So thank you, Yincho, for your good question. So I think it kind of, going back to my earlier answer about Tazara and about Jamie Monson's work, I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of how these development models are portrayed, that they don't emphasize, like large capital costs. So for example, if you look at infrastructure projects done by the Americans in like Afghanistan, that was all about huge capital costs. We're building dams. This is like, what is it, Concrete Revolution, the book by Snedden. In comparison to that, I think ROC missions really emphasized, low capital costs. We're going to do things that don't require large capital investments. They don't require a lot of infrastructure. In the interviews that I did, you require some infrastructure for agricultural development. Like you require building of irrigation canals. Sometimes you need pumps to pump water for irrigation. All of these things that the Taiwanese did in Africa, they really tried to do it on a really like shoestring budget. And so they tried to MacGyver as much as possible to use just kind of human-powered implements. And they really emphasized this when they spoke to African audiences. They emphasized that we are not about large capital costs. We're about working through practical, pragmatic means. And that's, I think, mirrored in the infrastructure projects that the PRC carried out in Africa as well. Of course, the PRC actually did like a massive infrastructure project in the Tazara Railway, whereas Taiwan never did anything like that. It was the Taiwanese missions the Taiwanese missions were only agriculture, veterinary medicine, so that was for like livestock, and then medicine, so practiced by doctors. And so they never were involved in the big infrastructure projects. But as Jamie Monson shows us, even in the big infrastructure projects, like the PRC still emphasized, labor and working as opposed to large capital investments.
I mean, it seems like we were chatting earlier, and you were saying that Ferguson got it so right in that pithy like description of development as anti-politics, the anti-politics machine. But in these two ways, that the development experts that Taiwan sends abroad are not a sort of development elite in the way we think about Western-based development aid, experts, and in their de-emphasis of capital. In these two ways, it's really different. Like something very different and distinct is going on in Taiwan, and I'm wondering how that might inform how we think about its politicalness.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that's why I emphasize kind of like the importance of post-colonial politics, because I think that was what shaped Taiwanese planners to think about what would be. I mean, I don't have like that smoke and gun document, but I do think that if you look at how the content of development changes depending on the audience, so when Taiwanese technocrats situate land reform for South Pacific nations, it's very much tailored to what they think their audience wants to hear. I think that's the case for Africa as well, where they situate this for African audiences, knowing that Africa is going to reject anything that's like high capital costs. They're going to reject anything that focuses on changing the political structure of their own government. And so I think that the Taiwanese planners knew this, and they knew that what would be more effective is framing it in a certain way. Yeah, but I don't think that changes the political nature. So I think Ferguson's still right.
Okay, there's a question that I thought we could end with, but are there any other questions in the audience here?
Just out of curiosity, how did these people negotiate cultural and linguistic differences?
So between, you want to?
Oh yeah, sorry. The question was how did the Taiwanese experts sent abroad negotiate cultural and linguistic differences?
So you mean between like the Taiwanese experts and the local? Yeah. This is where the oral histories really help, because I did not get a sense of this from the archival documents. Chapter 5, the Africa chapter, talks a lot about how the African technicians, the Taiwanese technicians sent to Africa lived. So the rural elites, the people who were the head of missions, tended to be highly educated. So those with like college degrees, they tended to live a privileged background. So they had like private drivers, they had personal translators. The blue collar technicians, so those from the nongxiao, those from the vocational technical schools, were the ones who were actually assigned to a particular geographic region in the field. So those are the ones who were rolling up their sleeves and working. The photos of like the National Taiwan University plant scientist, I think those were partially staged. I don't think that the plant scientist was working in the fields every day. I think that they were responsible for large swaths of territories, and on occasion they would probably go in there and show how it's done. But for the most part, they were living with their private chef, their private driver, their private interpreter in the main diplomatic compound. But the technicians, some of them learned the local languages in training centers before they left. I don't know how good their language training was. So for example, there's a building in National Taiwan University's campus that was used as a temporary training facility to train technicians in like what kind of training techniques do you teach in basic language. So mostly, if it's to Francophone West Africa, then French. And then sometimes Vietnamese. For the really important work, they had translators, but it wasn't like one translator per technician. It was like one translator for, I don't know how many teams. But the translators usually were for like the really important kind of bureaucratic stuff that they would utilize the translators for. And then cultural, it's quite interesting too, because the technical teams, this goes back to gender, were all men. And so I asked them, like, how did you live in Africa? And so I got some interesting stories. Some of the men would like play sports, or I think cards or mahjong or something on their time off. But there was also an interesting newspaper article about mixed race children from Taiwanese male African technicians. And very tragically, many of them were left behind when the Taiwanese technicians ended their missions and went back home. They abandoned their children. So, there's definitely kind of a mixed race history there too. And I didn't get to explore that too much, but there was a newspaper article about it.
So someone asks online if you are considering translating the book into Mandarin Chinese to reach local Taiwanese audiences.
Yes, and I was just talking with Yize about this, about what Pressy recommended. So yeah, I will be looking for a Taiwanese publisher. If you are editor at a Taiwanese press and you want to talk to me, my email is online. Yeah, so I definitely, it's a high priority for me. I would like to get this translated into Chinese. And I told Yize that my standard is how many Cenping can we get it into? Cenping is like it's like the Barnes and Noble of Taiwan. It's much more popular than Barnes and Noble. So yeah.
That's fantastic. That's wonderful to hear. And I'd like to invite everyone to join me again in congratulating James and thanking him.
Thank you.
For this talk.
And thank you, Sunila, for doing this.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Thank you all. And just a quick reminder, we'll have our spring colloquium next week for the Taiwan Studies program. So our 4 graduate students, if you want to come next Thursday, 2:30, we will have food and drink, unlike today. So come for the presentations and come for the food.